We have talked about tree intercropping, perennial crops, agroforestry, and so on, and various ways of managing grazing. But here, something specific under coming attractions is called pasture cropping, which was empirically discovered by Colin Sykes. Apparently, inherited a farm from his father, and father was doing trying to do innovations, but still depending on fertilizers, pesticides, and so on, doing traditional kind of cropping. Whereas there was a fire, and then Colin not only got hurt but lost everything that was on land. Apparently, he met somebody in a bar, and then came up with the idea of what is called pasture cropping. So you can see him standing here in a pasture. So basically the idea is to mix pasture for keeping livestock on the farm farm as where you would grow crops. So this article lists some of the figures from Colin Sykes himself. So harvesting oats as green native perennial pasture grows up between the cereal rows. So you can see there's literally perennial pasture is growing between oats, and the oats are being harvested while the perennial of course stays and regrows. And this is a figure that shows growth rates in kilogram per hectare per day for the season. So you have the red grass here growing during fall. So let's say we start in fall, winter months, and end in spring. Though this is the southern hemisphere, sorry, you have to be careful. So this will be spring, summer, and then fall seasons, and then you have the pasture and cereal species growing in somewhat in between, so in the winter, fall, winter months, right? So the idea is that the pasture cropping, just like we talked about the advantages of agroforestry and tree intercropping, and we talked about multi-level agroforestry of some sort, multi-strata tree intercropping, or whatever we called it at the time. This increases crop yields, sustained high pasture and animal production from cropped land. So Colin Sykes himself had to experiment, and initially the livestock lost weight because the protein content of the pasture was not high enough, but slowly he reduced the fertilizer use, pesticide use, saved tens of thousands of dollars on those inputs, and everything began to get better: soil moisture, crops, pasture, livestock health, and so on. So this is kind of the summary of those ideas. So sustained high pasture and animal production from cropped land, increased fodder for livestock, high rates of carbon biosequestration. This is always something we are aiming for here under drawdown. Marked improvement in the water holding capacity of the soils, so soil moisture persistence and soil health goes up, so that soil moisture water holding capacity goes up, carbon increases. That's what happens, as we saw before. Improved nutrient cycling, improvements in biodiversity and resilience even under drought stress. Australia undergoes these cycles of El Nino and La Nina, which are always generating drought cycles as well. It's basically a desert mostly, but it's like California and agriculture, right? Significantly reduced input costs and risks, so fertilizers and pesticides and so on gone. Improved economic return from the vertical stacking of enterprises. So you have multiple pasture, crops, livestock, so you have enterprises stacked up. Improved happiness quotient on the farm. This is the core benefit that cannot always be put in terms of monetary values, right? So that's a short section, but a very important one in terms of coming attractions, pasture cropping. As always, these are not something that a blueprint that you can take somewhere and start implementing. You have to do work in terms of what is suitable for that climate. So for the tropics, will it work? What kind of crops can be mixed with pasture, and how to do the grazing, because you have to protect the crops from the livestock as well. So you need the various types of grazing we talked about, like the rotational rotational pasture, rotational grazing management, and so on and so forth. So always there are details. These are methods that are empirically evolved, and they seem to be adopted at more and more farms in Australia. Will it work in Asia? Will it work in Africa, South America, and so on? Has to be explored, especially for its mix of crops and climate options.